After watching this episode, and even in retrospect to reading this in the manga some time ago, I really look at the material and stop to think to myself for a second, where the fuck did Hisui and everyone else think 10,000 dragons were going to come from, if not from Eclipse? I mean, if you look at it rationally, let's just say, because even in this episode, Lucy said 400 years ago when dragons really existed. So that, first of all, has always been confusing regarding, do they know if dragons exist or not? Because they know that Natsu and some of the Dragon Slayers had dragons with them when they were little, but it never really kind of gets addressed, so it's always just been something very vague regarding when the dragons were there, why no one else has seen them or anything. But regardless of that fact, where the hell did Hisui, the princess, and everyone else in Fior think that 10,000 dragons were going to come from? Were they going to fly out of my ass? Like, where the fuck do you think 10,000 dragons come from, if not from this giant portal, which coincidentally, two people came from timelines back here? Like, that definitely had me a little bit like, ding dong, hello. I mean, okay, they do know that there are some dragons here because they did face the Acnologia, but 10,000 dragons? Like, I think it's just ridiculous to think that 10,000 dragons would be roaming the earth and you wouldn't have seen, like, you know, a couple hundred of them here or there, for that matter. Like, you've only seen, what, the Acnologia is, like, the only dragon that, for the most part, aside from the Dragon Slayers, that they've ever seen. So why would you go about with this whole plan and everything if you don't see the dragons? Or wouldn't you just hold off a little bit until you can get things together for the dragons to come? Once you see something like a sign, you know, there they are, then maybe, yeah, it'll be a little bit slow, there might be some casualties, but it would have been smarter than going along with this fucking nut job rogue. Now, this week's episode, that door finally opens and the dragons start coming out. It felt a little bit different from the manga, because if I remember right, in the manga, it kind of felt like they were pouring out of there, but in the anime, it was kind of like they were just slowly walking out of there, like, yo, dog, I'm here. And it was just amazing to me that the guards were just like, oh, it's coming out, and nobody was immediately like saying, hey, you know, how about we start closing these things? Like, everybody should have been frantic to close those gates immediately once they saw the very first one come out, except, like, nobody was really like that except Lucy. Like, I look at Hisui and I look at everybody like, you should have trusted a big titty blonde. This is what happens when you don't trust a big titty blonde. And the cliffhanger from the end of last week's episode is basically that Lucy had one of her celestial spirits investigating what was going on, and she found out at the last minute what was happening. So she was pretty much the only one that was trying to understand things and kind of, you know, on the prowl. And I think that with all that's going on, especially the threat of 10,000 dragons, Hisui should have done a little bit more research, should have been a little bit more cautious, and ultimately the kingdom should have been a little bit more cautious. They just fell right into Future Rogue's little trap. There were some pretty epic moments in this episode, though. Makarov and all the magicians going in. For some reason, Makarov is always one of my favorite characters. Whenever there's a moment where he's about to beast, it's just like, he really gets you excited when he's like, everybody, all my brats, let's go. We already talked about this. Go for the legs. And I'm like, there's giant dragons coming out of this portal. Who knows how many at this particular point when he's saying, go, go. And yet this old man is still, like, ready to rumble. Like, that's one thing I love. Like, Makarov, beast, old man. And the manga was a little bit more disappointed than in the anime, because seeing the ferocity of these creatures, these dragons, they look more, you know, just gigantic, and they seem more ferocious in the anime than they did in the manga when they come out and they're just roaring, screaming. So while it's not 10,000 that I felt we were kind of promised, and it still to a certain degree feels a little bit like, oh, the magical number 7, Hiro loves that number 7. It still ultimately, it plays up a lot better in the anime than in the manga, I will say that, because these 7 dragons, I mean, nothing is doing damage to them. Get a clue, you have Dragon Slayers, there are dragons. How do you say dragons? You use Dragon Slayers. Ding dong! And there was a bit of progression. They closed the gates within this episode. Lucy and Yukino worked together, seeing all the celestial spirits. And I really would like at some given point for Yukino to just, I don't know, drop dead or something and give those keys to Lucy so she can get all of them. Because it kind of feels like an awkward state at this particular point where Lucy's goal, one of her goals was, you know, I want to collect all the keys that I can. But with Yukino having them, unless Yukino gives them and she fully accepts the last few keys that Yukino has, or Yukino dies, there's no way for Lucy to really achieve her goal without being a dick. Like, hey, let's battle, and, you know, if I win, I take your keys. So it's kind of an awkward thing right now. And this episode definitely makes you question Rogue's motives overall, because he comes in, he says, I have dragon manipulation magic. Now I can control these dragons. And he's like, 10,000 was a little too much. So yeah, I might have been going a little bit crazy with that. Which in that case, why the fuck would you even attempt to bring out 10,000 dragons if that's just way too much for you to control? But it's like, oh, 7 now. So I guess the fuck up worked out in his favor, but he was still trying to get rid of both Lucys. So ultimately, they still would have been pouring out of that gate. So wouldn't he have tried to at least keep one Lucy alive to let out a decent amount of dragons and then close the gate, forcing her to close it? Future Rogue didn't think that far ahead, I guess. And I ain't gonna lie, one of my favorite scenes, and it seems as though the anime is just making Natsu, like, almost every other episode, I'm like, damn, Natsu looks kind of cool. He looks kind of beast. At the very least, the anime is doing a good job of making him look epic in a sense where I'm just kind of like, yo, Natsu, kick some fucking ass when he's just standing there on top of the roof of that building and holding on to that thing, looking at Future Rogue like, I'm gonna fuck you up. I was like, yeah, Natsu, the anime doing you justice, bro. In the manga, I'm kind of like, oh, Natsu's ready to get up. Cool, whatever. Anime, I'm like, Natsu, go put in work, bro. Do your thing. So it was a good episode. The animation in certain areas where they like moving, there was like a couple particular scenes I remember where I was just like, why the fuck does it look so bad, the animation? But then there was times where it actually looked decent and the art actually looked pretty good in certain areas. So it was a blend of like some decent stuff, some kind of bad looking stuff. So ultimately animation was subpar. The actual progression, we got decent progression. And there was just certain areas where I was just kind of like, why the fuck? This doesn't make sense. Certain areas where it's like, where the fuck did you possibly think 10,000 dragons were going to come from? Also, Future Rogue said he couldn't control 10,000 dragons, yet he had no backup plan to close that door, so he was going to just lose control eventually and get fucked up. So 7 out of 10, good one. I'm looking forward to seeing Natsu go off against Future Rogue in the next week's episode and seeing some of these dragons, because the anime is making them look a little bit more impressive than the manga did. We got Atlas Flame, Zirconi is a dragon of jade, so things is looking proper with the dragons, and I'm a lot more excited for them in the anime than I was in the manga, I'll tell you that right now. Why 7, Hero? What is your obsession with the number 7? But let me know what you think of this episode. Overall thoughts of it. Were you excited for the dragons? What do you think about everything I was discussing? A couple of questions that I had. But that's all I have for this review. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. If you liked anything I had to say or enjoyed the video, drop me a like. I'd greatly appreciate it. And if you haven't subscribed, you can do so as well. That'd be awesome. I'm Finette World. And as always, people, have an awesome day. Now, after watching this episode, and even in retrospect to reading this in the manga some time ago, I really look at the material and stop to think to myself for a second, where the fuck did Hisui and everyone else think 10,000 dragons were going to come from, if not from Eclipse? I mean, if you look at it rationally, let's just say, because even in this episode, Lucy said 400 years ago when dragons really existed. So that, first of all, has always been confusing regarding, do they know if dragons exist or not? Because they know that Natsu and some of the Dragon Slayers had dragons with them when they were little, but it never really kind of gets addressed, so it's always just been something very vague regarding when the dragons were there, why no one else has seen them or anything. But regardless of that fact, where the hell did Hisui, the princess, and everyone else in Fior think that 10,000 dragons were going to come from? Were they going to fly out of my ass? Like, where the fuck do you think 10,000 dragons come from, if not from this giant portal, which coincidentally, 2 people came from timelines back here? Like,